In this last week in the life of Jesus here on earth, we make a very important observation. We observe the authenticity and the integrity of the people who truly follow Jesus, compared to all the religious people who are around Jesus at the time. Now, all of these people that we read in this story were all devoted to religion. They were all religious people. It was part of that, even their culture, that the people were religious. But that's where the similarity ends. Today we're going to observe a significant difference between those who are followers of Jesus and those who are religious. Needless to say, not much has changed in the last 2,000 years to where we get to today. There is one critical difference between those who are followers of Jesus and the religious people. That's why I've entitled my sermon this morning, The Hypocrisy of Religion. The hypocrisy of religion. We're going to look at 7 verbs that John uses to describe the 7 different demographics of the people in this story, in these first 11 verses. And through these verbs and these characteristics, we're going to see how John describes the hypocrisy of religion. Let's have a look at what the text tells us. As always, in the Gospel of John, before we get to any passage, John always gives us a context so that you know where the story fits into the equation of things. Verse 1, John chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. The last time we heard from Jesus, he was where? Your turn. Where was Jesus the last time we read about in this gospel? Ephraim. Where's Ephraim? Trick question. We don't know. It's in the wilderness somewhere. Why did Jesus go to Ephraim in the wilderness with his disciples? Yeah, so the chief priest had planned to kill Jesus. It wasn't the right time. He went to Ephraim to just get ready for this last week in his journey. Now we read, he comes from Ephraim and he comes to Bethany. Now John decides to leave out all the details between the journey from Ephraim to Bethany. Matthew, Mark and Luke discuss these, the passing through Jericho, the healing of the 2 blind men, the conversion of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the parable of the 10 minas. John leaves all of that out in his account because he wants to emphasise something much more important, and that is what happens here in Bethany. So we know now it's 6 days before the Passover. Anybody want to have a guess what day it is?
Monday.
Good guess, but no.
Friday.
Good guess, but no.
Saturday.
When was the Passover lamb prepared?
Friday.
Thursday.
Oh.
So this means it's Friday in Bethany. And what is Friday? The day before? The Sabbath day. So where do you think Jesus is going to spend the Sabbath? In Bethany, with the Bethany family. And then he goes on to Jerusalem for his last week, starting on Sunday after the Sabbath. He goes to Jerusalem. We'll read about that later on. So here we have the context. It's the end of March, it's 33 AD, and Jesus is in Bethany with his dear family, all three siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Wow. So now we've got the context. It's the week before he dies. And in verse 2 we read, here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour, a Sabbath dinner. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table. We read later on that a whole town turned out, and a whole bunch of people from Jerusalem also came up to Bethany. Why do you think the people from Jerusalem came to Bethany? To see Lazarus. Hey, there's a guy who died, buried for 4 days. He's having dinner with Jesus. And so crowds outside on the front street, just like I can see as I'm preaching, people coming looking in through the window. And we read that Martha served. Now, Martha gets a really hard time. And I don't think we should do that. I think that's good crowd preaching, but it's not good biblical text. Martha served because she was probably a really good cook. And let me tell you, when I come and visit your place and someone spends time preparing a meal, like yesterday we went to Grace and Arnold's place, we had dim sum for lunch. Now, Grace went and got the dim sum. I'm glad she went and served the food and prepared it because we had a fantastic dim sum. Someone's got to prepare the food if you're going to have a good lunch. Don't give Martha a hard time. She was the organiser. She organised the meal. She prepared the meal. Without her, the meal wouldn't have happened. It would have been, hi, Jesus, welcome. All we got is Vegemite sandwiches, which would be okay, but it's not really something you'd serve the Son of God. So here's the point. I just want to make the first thing. We thank God for servants. The people who follow Jesus are true servants. And you think back in your life, the times you've served Jesus. All the times you've served Jesus. So here's number one. Here's the first verb. Martha served. That's a good thing to do. To serve. That's a good integrity, authenticity thing. Then we read that Lazarus was reclining at the table with Jesus. I'm trying to imagine that if I was because the disciples were there too, I'm trying to imagine that they weren't sitting at a table. You know, Middle East, they were leaning on one shoulder around a central table, their heads towards the centre of the table, their feet away from the table, lying on carpets, leaning on carpets. I'm trying to imagine that, sitting at the table with Lazarus.
I hope he took a bath.
He did. Imagine that, sitting with Lazarus. Turn to Lazarus, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, how are you?
I stink no more.
I stinketh no more. Imagine sitting there. Wouldn't you be wanting to ask him, what was it like when you were dead? What did you see?
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to sell and write a book that's going to be a bestseller. It's funny how people who go into heaven need to write a book and tell the world about it and make a profit on it. How you feeling, Lazarus? Fine. How are you? Don't know. I think I'm fine. It's weird. It would be weird sitting there. And you can imagine all the crowds at the front of the house. What would that be like? Either way, the story is that Lazarus is reclining with Jesus at the table, having fellowship, listening, talking, sharing, asking Jesus, if you were sitting at the table with Jesus, what would you be asking? What would you be asking Lazarus? What would you be saying if you were sitting at a table after you had died? Well, guess what? For many of us who remember our conversion, that's exactly what it was like to have communion for the first time. We reclined at a table after having been dead for 22 years. And then we had fellowship with Jesus. That's why we do communion every week, right? It's not just something you put in the... No, this is part of the story. You were dead, and he saved you and brought life to you. And we do this to remind ourselves that we're reclining at the table with Jesus. Lazarus is here, Mary and Martha there, the 12 are over here, and then all the saints. Just imagine and think about all the times when you've reclined with Jesus in your life and you've had fellowship with him. You've served him, you've had fellowship with him. Here's the second verb, Lazarus reclined. Then, in verse 3, we read that Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, poured it on his feet, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now Mary comes into the room and anoints Jesus' feet. Here's a question for you. How many times did someone anoint Jesus' feet with perfume? At least twice. Because we read in the Gospels, 2 days before the Passover, a woman came and anointed his head with oil. And it possibly, depends on how you read it, the scholars are out on this, could be even 3 times, but at least twice. Now that is a sermon for another day. How many times was Jesus anointed? This wasn't the only time, but this time we're in Bethany and Mary comes and takes this expensive perfume in an alabaster jar, which is like fragrance proof. It's perfectly sealed, and it's this nard that comes from a plant, from a resin from a plant. And there's even a more expensive nard that doesn't come from the Middle East, which this was. There's one that comes from India that's even more expensive. The point is that she takes this perfume, which she's been saving up for years, and she pours it on his feet in an act of devotion and worship. Now, your turn. Why do you think John adds this parenthetical statement, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume? Why do you think John adds that little touch to the story? Apart from quoting some old poets, he was there. And the thing he noticed was the whole house was filled with this. This is something that he experienced in the middle of the house, in the middle of what was going on. And he remembered that. Everywhere I went, I could smell this perfume. So here we have an account of Mary worshipping Jesus. Can you think back of the times when you have worshipped Jesus? You've reclined with him, you've served him, and you've worshipped him. So, number 3, Mary anointed. Mary anointed. Martha served, Lazarus reclined, Mary anointed. Now we come to the next section in the commentary, and John starts this next section with the word but. This contrasting attitude. Now remember, we're talking about religious people here. These are all people who are familiar with the temple and religion and Judaism and all of that. The next section, verse 4, starts with the word but. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It's worth a year's wages. Now, John adds another parenthetical statement to put everything into context. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He used to put his hand into the money bag. So now we come to the next person in the story, Judas Iscariot, and he speaks up, and he is complaining about the action of Mary. This is just a total waste. He's so pragmatic that he doesn't understand worship. That happens with religious people a lot. You've got to get the liturgy so right that you forget about why you're doing it. And Ed and I have both been in churches where the liturgy was perfect and Jesus wasn't anywhere to be found. There's a year's wages in this. Literally, in the text, 300 denarii. A denarius is a 1 day's salary. 300 days' work. Take off for the Sabbath, public holidays. That's about a full year's salary. That's a lot of money. And, says Judas, this could have all been given to the poor. This is very pragmatic, is very expedient. And do you see this? Do you see the hypocrisy in this? How many pieces of silver did Judas use to betray Jesus? 30 pieces of silver, 30 shekels. Shekels because the chief priests who paid him wouldn't have paid him with Roman money, they would have paid him with Jewish money, temple money. 30 pieces of silver, shekels. It's about 120 denarius, which is 120 days' work, 4 months' worth of salary. So Judas is complaining that she used a year's salary to worship Jesus, and he betrayed Jesus for 4 months' worth of salary. Total hypocrisy. And then to care about the poor. Like, do you think Judas really cared about the poor? This was the expedient thing to do. Why worship Jesus when you could feed the poor? Totally expedient. That's the nature of the religious people. Remember earlier, Caiaphas stood up and said it would be far better for one man to die and the whole nation to be saved. Totally expedient. Forget about the reality of worship. We're just going to be so pragmatic and so practical that we can't even see who's standing in front of us. The truth was actually something totally different than was presented to us. Now get this, Judas was a disciple of Jesus. You can't get closer to Jesus than that. And even in the disciples, John has to make a parenthetical statement to help us understand that not all religious people, even in the inner circle, have authenticity and integrity. Your turn. How does John describe Judas? He was a thief. Now, it wasn't that he stole sometimes. No, he was given a noun. This is his personality. He is a thief. Why is he a thief? Because he steals. There's a difference between telling a lie once in a while and being a liar. Okay, we struggle with sin. Get that. But we're not sinners. We're redeemed. You might steal maybe a penny or 10 cents, whatever. but you're not a thief. There's a subtle difference here. And John says that Judas was a thief. He used to help himself to the pot, the money. And that's a disciple. He was a thief. He wasn't a disciple. The utter hypocrisy. So here's the next verb, number 4. Judas objected. Judas objected. Martha served, Lazarus reclined, Mary worshipped. Judas objected. And then we see Jesus' response to the hypocrisy. He says, leave her alone. This was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. Simply saying this was a prophetic act because I'm going to die, and when the body's dead, they anoint the body. She's anointing this body as a prophecy of what's going to happen. You'll always have the poor, but you won't always have me with you. Yes, look, you can deal with issues, and the poor will always be here, but Mary was worshipping. She doesn't do this every day. She doesn't take a pint of pure nard every day and pour it on my feet. This was a one-time act of worship for her. And Jesus says to Judas, leave her alone. It's really a rebuke.
More than that, this was the culture where the woman's security is in storing perfume. And that would be her security. It's almost like a dowry given to her, and that's her security for the future.
Yes.
So basically, she gave her
Future away, right. She gave her dowry away. Yeah, that's a really important implication there. This worship cost her something. But the point was, Jesus is rebuking Judas because he's saying, look, here's the thing. If you think you're going to solve the problem of the poor in the world, guess what? While there are human beings alive and while there is sin on the earth, you will never solve the problem of poverty. These people at the international level who say that we want to solve poverty, we can help raise people, but you're never going to solve the problem of poverty. Jesus made it really plain here. But look, I'm not going to be on earth all the time, and in fact they didn't know, but he knew that in a week's time he was going to die. Jesus was in fact rebuking Judas. For Judas, it was a waste of money. For Mary, it was a one-time act of pure devotion. Jesus said to Judas, Judas, you need to put your religion into practice. You need to put your religion into practice. He was rebuking the hypocrisy of Judas. So number 5, Jesus rebuked. He hates hypocrisy. Jesus hates it when you're all religious and you don't live it. That's why so many people get turned off the church, you know that, in North America. Because people who go to church call themselves Christians, but Monday to Saturday, they live no differently to the people in the rest of the world. Nobody could even tell that they're different. So now we come to the next demographic, verse 9. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him also, but because of Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. Move down a couple of verses, verse 11. For on account of him, Jesus, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. So, meanwhile, back at the house, there's a large crowd of people out the front of the house. Imagine that you're sitting having dinner at your place and all the press are outside. Not just from Bethany, but from Jerusalem. It's only 2 kilometres away. When we walk up from Jerusalem, we hear that Lazarus, the dead guy, is there. They wanted to see. They were really curious. And when they saw Lazarus and they saw Jesus looking through, they could see through the window. Probably no windows, but you get it. we read that many of the Jews were believing in him. Chief priests didn't like that. But let me tell you something about this belief. For the large crowd, this belief in Jesus was simply mental assent. Yep, we think he's the Messiah. It's not going to change the way I live. Not important to me. Yep, people saying he's the Messiah. Yep, I think he's the Messiah. They believed in Jesus. 2 days later, when he enters into Jerusalem, they're shouting, "Hosanna! Hosanna to the King of Kings!" 5 days later, they're shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" You see, belief in Jesus doesn't necessarily mean you follow him. Belief in Jesus means, yeah, okay, he's God, big deal. Has no impact on my life. And for many, many church people in North America, they believe in Jesus. They even come forward and they say a prayer at an altar call. They get baptized. They sing the hymns. They even give money in the church. But they don't follow Jesus. He's not their rabbi. They use the term Lord, but they don't really mean it. Because when you say Lord, that means you do whatever he tells you and you spend the rest of your life trying to find out what he wants you to do and you do it. That's what it means to believe in Jesus. He becomes your rabbi. Not just some philosophical theory. Many, many church people just believe in Jesus, but they don't ever follow him. They don't dedicate their life to doing what he wants them to do. No, I'm too busy. I've got my job. I've got to raise money. I've got a house, car payments. Yeah, but what about following Jesus? I'm going to tell you something that I think is I was counting up the years. I've been doing Christian work now for well over 40 years. And like Ed, we've been around. I've travelled all over the world. I've met Christians. I've been to conferences. Got conferences in my brain, too many conferences. I tell you something in the West, there are a lot of people in the church who are going to be really, really disappointed when Jesus returns. Because they're going to say to Jesus, "Hey, we called you Lord, Lord. And we did all these things in your name." And he's going to say, "I never even knew you." And why is he going to say, "I never really knew you"? Because they never followed him. They just acknowledged him. Okay, yeah, he's God, good, but I'm going to go on and live my life. I think in the West, in the Western world, there are going to be many, many Christians who are really going to be disappointed when Jesus returns. Because too many of us are like the crowd. We have just believed in him. I'm not saying that's your case, because I know you pretty well. But in the world that I've travelled in, a lot of people that go to church on Sunday, Monday to Saturday, and they just believed in their mind that he was God, but that was it. But their hearts and their wills and their actions showed that they weren't followers of Jesus. So here's number 6, the crowd. Here's the verb for the crowd. The crowd believed. You can put in brackets mental assent. They weren't necessarily followers. Now, the price to follow Jesus is way higher than we think. It cost God his son's life so you can have salvation. Do you think following Jesus is just mental assent and it's going to be that cheap? No, it's going to cost you everything. And then finally, the last demographic is verse 10 in John 12. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. In the previous chapter, the last conversation, they had already planned to kill Jesus. Now they want to kill Lazarus as well. Collateral damage, just get rid of whatever evidence. Now, These are the religious leaders. We've got a disciple, we got the large crowd who all believed in him, and the religious leaders. These are all people who were religious. The theologians and the professors of religion and theology of the day. They were the pastors of the churches. They were the political, religious ruling class. These guys knew the scriptures off by heart. They knew all the laws and the rules. And yet they plotted not only to kill Jesus, but to kill Lazarus as well. Just because he raised from the dead. It doesn't get more evil than that. And these guys are not the Babylonians or the Moabites who offered children to worship, child sacrifices to their God. These are the men, the religious leaders of Israel doing this. They don't just want to kill babies, they want to kill God. That's bad. And religious leaders for the last 2,000 years have been killing God. You can go to churches now, you'd be lucky to find God anywhere in the church, some churches. The problem was that these religious leaders were solely motivated by their own self-preservation. They were far more interested in remaining in power and in control of the masses than they were in the authenticity of who Jesus was. The massive hypocrisy. Now, number 7, the verb for the chief priests. The chief priests schemed. Judas objected. The crowd believed, mental assent, and the chief priests schemed. You see the difference in the verbs? Served, reclined, anointed. That's the true followers of Jesus. The religious people, the crowds, objected, believed, and schemed. And Jesus rebuked that. So let me close. The Bethany family are a great example for us. Sometimes you serve, sometimes you recline, and sometimes you anoint. We do that. All of us do that. We don't always just serve. We don't always just recline. We don't always worship. We do all of those. That's what we do in a service. That's what you do in your week. That's what true followers of Jesus do. But the religious class, they object. Oh my gosh. How many objections have we had over the years, Ed, for people complaining about something in the... I had a little old lady, this is way another church. She said to me once, at the end of the church service, she said, "Do you realise the service went 15 minutes over today?" And as I was shaking her hand as she was leaving the church, I said, "Boy, I hope God wasn't upset." Religious people tend to object a lot. Here's another thing I want to give you a warning. Watch out for the crowd. Be careful. Wherever there's a large crowd of people, be careful. Large crowds don't always necessarily tell you the truth. They might believe, but they may not be followers of Jesus. Watch out for the peer pressure of the large crowd. We've got to go over there. There's a huge whatever. Be careful of that.
Say no to the herd.
Say no. You do. Don't say no to the herds. Say no to the herd. Say yes to the herds. But be careful with that. You know, there's something in the human condition. We always want to go where the big thing is, right? Be careful with that. Doesn't necessarily mean God's not there, but no guarantees. Just because it's big, You got a large crowd here. They believed, and they had, they were triumphal entry. They were worshipping Jesus. And then within a couple of days, they were shouting out at Pilate, crucify him. Like, watch out for the crowd. And the chief priests, you be careful who you trust in leadership in the church. You be very careful. The sheep know the pastor's voice. The pastor knows the sheep's voice. I'll say this, you better hold me to account, which you do. And if I say something wrong, you better tell me. Huh? If you see something in my life that doesn't match up, you better confront me and tell me. Because I do that to you every Sunday in a sermon. Because people have been so hurt by religious leaders. I don't know why. You should be surprised. John's been telling this for 2,000 years. So, let me remind you, as you navigate the world in which you live, and you leave here on Sunday and you go out to the world and you go back into your world wherever you are, let me remind you that out there is a Christian religious world. And you will meet lots of religious people. And they will all tell you that they believe in Jesus. But that's where the similarity ends. You see, in the religious world, there are two types of people. There are religious people and there are followers of Jesus, and they are not synonymous. There are religious people and there are followers of Jesus. All followers of Jesus have a form of religion, that's healthy, but not all religious people are followers of Jesus. And you mustn't be naive about that. Just because you visit a church and it's called church and they say they're Christian doesn't mean that they're followers of Jesus. Has anybody ever had that experience?
Yes.
Sylvia, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just have a
Yeah, please.
question. People that do theology of liberation against poverty, like they try to help very poor people and to erase poverty, and against persecution for religious value, amongst other things, they believe that fighting poverty is the main activity they should do as a worship, as a Christian.
Yeah.
Would you?
Yeah, that's a great comment, great question. So, we should all be working to help the poor. All of us. And some of us are called to do that full time as a ministry. We help the poor. We should always. And poor is a relative term, right? Even in Africa, everybody has a cell phone, even if they're living in a village. But the idea that we will erase poverty from the earth by our efforts is a false premise. We will always have poverty because we will always have sin. And while we have sin, there will always be people who will abuse other people at their expense. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't serve and help the poor. Jesus told us we should do that. But Jesus was saying in this case, be careful, because if you think that one day there will be no longer poor people on the planet, you're mistaken. But we should always serve the poor.
And Judas's thing was pretense of helping the poor, whereas Mary was worshiping. So, Judas was commenting on, saying, oh, well, we should help the poor, and that's why she shouldn't be worshiping you like this.
Judas was using it as an excuse. But thank you for clarifying that. We should all be serving the poor. But remember that if you want a place where there's no more poor people, you have to go to heaven for that. Janice.
So if it's Jesus first, you do what he tells you to do.
Sorry, say it. The heater's making a bit of noise.
It's Jesus first, you do what he tells you to do.
Yes.
Because we get wrapped up and so focused on helping other people
Yeah.
things for the wrong reason.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Janice. Did you hear that? So you can get so wrapped up in helping the poor or doing whatever ministry, you forget about Jesus in the process. The reason we're helping the poor is because of Jesus. The reason we clean the planet is because of Jesus. But so many people, and that happens in many churches, we get so caught up in what I would call land rights for gay Wales and everything in between, every social issue you could ever think of, and we never talk about Jesus. And we have this great empathy for the world, but it's founded on just airy-fairy we care. It's not founded on the principles of the gospel of Jesus. So don't get distracted by that. There are religious people and there are followers of Jesus. And the reading today hopefully helped us see that there's a difference between being a follower of Jesus and being religious. Martha served, Lazarus reclined, Mary anointed. Judas objected, the crowd believed, the priest schemed, and Jesus rebuked. I don't need to tell you the difference. Religious people talk the walk. Followers of Jesus walk the talk. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this story today from the Gospel of John. May it impact our lives every day that we might be followers of you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.